Hello souls and demons, and welcome back to the portal. Today's story is written by the wonderful getyaisha, titled Flesh and Blood, and part 2 being Flesh and Bone. So sit back, grip your seats, and enjoy. Sitting on the roof of his apartment complex, Alex watched the city burning against the night sky. He didn't know why or how any of this happened, but it didn't matter anymore. All that mattered now was staying alive. For a second, he thought about his family and friends that might have survived. The thought of seeing his parents again saddened him and filled his head with visions of the old days. In the back of his mind, he wondered how much longer it would be. How much longer could he scavenge for food and hide in the ruins praying for a God that clearly wasn't listening anymore? Before all this started, Alex had been a graphic artist. He found it funny that he of all people was still alive. In the movies, it was always a soldier or a cop that fought the good fight and led others to safety. Not some guy who was good at drawing and could barely start a campfire without ending up with third-degree burns. He sat there watching fireballs streak up into the sky. No doubt from an exploding gas station, or maybe survivors fighting it out over the last few scraps of food. It didn't really matter. Hopping down off his stoop, he gathered up his gear, a backpack filled with beef jerky, water, and extra ammo for the AK-47 he'd found in the remains of an old crack house. He walked the darkened halls of the building using the wall as his guide. Using lights was dangerous. Any little thing could attract nomads, or even worse, cannibals. And in either case, he wouldn't be able to fight them all off by himself. Slowly moving, he did his best to stay quiet. As he made it to the stairwell, a sound reverberated through the building, echoing in the empty halls. For a second, he thought it was just his imagination. Wishful thinking, or maybe he had finally gone over the edge and lost his mind. Then he heard it again. Is anyone there? Hello? Someone please help us. Was this a trap? It had to be. No one would be stupid enough to be making that much noise. Or was this all in his mind? He couldn't be sure. Opening the door that led to the stairs, the overwhelming stink of rotting bodies gagged him before he could pull on his mask. As the door closed behind him, Alex pulled out his flashlight and clicked it on. Since there were no windows in the stairwell, there was no risk of the light being spotted, so it was safe. Peering over the rail, he shined the light down on the pile of rotting flesh, stacked up on the bottom floor. While the smell was horrific, and looking at all of them made his stomach lurch, the bodies turned most people away, leaving the upper floors pretty much untouched. He'd been in this building for weeks now, and it was time to venture out. He was running low on water, and with any luck, he might be able to find someone in the warehouses a few blocks away. The voice cried out again as he made his way down to the 3rd floor. Is anyone there? Please help us. Alex froze in place and clicked off the light just as the 1st floor entrance to the stairwell opened. He stood there perfectly still, listening to what sounded like a woman puking her guts out at the discovery of the dozen or so bodies piled up at the bottom of the stairs. When the door slammed shut, he rushed down to the 2nd floor landing and stopped to listen. He could hear the woman's voice, but couldn't make out what she was saying. The one thing he heard clearly was, "It's okay. Mama's gonna get you some help." It sounded as if she were talking to a child. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he made his way to the front door. Alex paused for a second to take a breath, then threw it open and stepped out. Looking around, he didn't see her at first. It took a few seconds before he heard her voice. "It's okay, sweetie, we're going to find help." Making his way up to the corner of the building, he finally saw her. She was sitting a few feet away, but she was alone. "What are you doing here?" His voice startled the woman. She jolted to her feet, turning to see Alex standing there aiming his gun at her. "Please don't shoot." "Who are you talking to?" he yelled out, keeping his distance. The woman held up her hands. "No one. Please don't shoot me. I'm just passing through." Alex looked around, scanning the area. He knew what he'd heard. She was lying. "Look, I know you're here with someone. Now cut the bullshit. Where are they?" She slowly motioned her left hand, and a young girl stepped out from a doorway just out of his sight. The girl couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old. They were both filthy, and looked like they hadn't eaten in a while. The girl's legs were wrapped in what looked like torn pieces of a t-shirt. She was bleeding and her clothes were torn. "Please, sir. My daughter and I were attacked by a pack of wild dogs. We need help." A few years after things went to hell, packs of wild dogs became a huge problem. A small pack of 3 or 4 good-sized dogs could kill a man. A girl that size didn't stand a chance. Something about these two didn't feel right to him. If they'd survived the dogs, they had to have weapons, and Alex didn't see a gun. "How'd you get away from the dogs?" The woman smiled. "My husband killed them." Something hard came down on the back of his head, and Alex dropped to the ground unconscious. When he came to, his bag and gun were gone. "Jesus, I should have known better," he muttered to himself, rolling over to his back. Life was hard for him before the world fell apart. Now even he was amazed that he hadn't died yet. Staring up at the night sky, thoughts of the old world floated through his memory. He could remember watching airplanes soar through the sky and cars zooming along the highways. He missed his computers and, as much as his job got on his last nerve, there were times he would have given his last scrap of bread just to be punching the clock. Getting up from the ground, dusting himself off, Alex went back into the apartment building. He had other backpacks and an assortment of baseball bats, machetes, and knives, but no guns. Without a weapon, he was as good as dead. But without water, his chances weren't much better. The choice was simple. He was going to have to risk it. Knowing there was a chance he wouldn't make it back to the building for a few days, Alex piled junk around the stairwell door before he left. The junk wouldn't fool anyone, but most scavengers wouldn't waste time going through a building like this. It was too risky. Once he was satisfied that the building was secure, he started walking. The trip wouldn't take that long, but he was going to be moving slow, trying to keep out of sight. The first area he would have to get through was the neighborhood that surrounded his complex. For the most part, it had been abandoned years ago. Huge sections were burnt to ash during the riots. The rest of the neighborhood had been picked clean, but from time to time, nomads would hold up there sometimes, sticking around for weeks before moving on. Nomads or scavengers, they trade in drugs, alcohol, and tobacco primarily, but don't underestimate them. They're cold-blooded killers and won't hesitate to strip a wanderer to the bone if they see a profit in it. Alex had problems with them in the past. A group called The Family nearly killed him a few months back, over a bottle of water, and he was in no hurry to deal with anyone like that again. The first few blocks were quiet, and considering there was no place to hide, he couldn't be happier. Once he'd passed the rows of burnt-out homes, Alex stopped and waited in the overgrown bushes that lined the yard of an old house. The place reminded him of where he'd grown up, even though it was a husk of rotted wood and broken windows. He couldn't help but smile, glancing over at the tire swing that somehow still swayed in the breeze. Little things like that gave him flashbacks of a better time, and he wondered if the world would ever go back to the way it used to be. Sadly, this was the new normal, and in his heart he knew that world was gone, replaced with a bleak, surreal landscape, populated by madmen and cannibalistic lunatics. When he was sure there was no one on the street, he emerged from his hiding spot and moved on to the next block. The second he turned the corner, he knew there was a problem. There was an old shopping cart filled with scrap, sitting in front of one of the houses. He checked this area not long ago, and that cart wasn't there. Someone had to be close by. Moving as quickly and quietly as possible, Alex got across the street and hid just inside the doorway of another house, patiently watching and waiting for someone to come back. The minutes came and went, and still no one came. He was just about to move on, thinking maybe someone had abandoned the cart, when a figure stepped out from the house. A tall, thin man dressed in rags cautiously stepped out in the yard and scanned the area looking for signs of anyone waiting for him. After a few seconds, the man whistled and a second figure came out. This one was much smaller, clearly a child, but from where he was hiding, Alex couldn't tell if these were the people that had jumped him earlier. Watching from the shadows, he waited until they were nearing the end of the street to come out. When he was sure they were far enough away, he slowly stepped out, rushed to the next home and hid. Continuing like this, he cleared the street, and as he made it to the end of the block, the sound of a child screaming cut through the silence. He didn't want to get mixed up in someone else's problem, but the way that child was screaming made his blood run cold. Moving up to the last house on the street, Alex peeked around the corner and spotted a group of 4 men surrounding the tall man and the child. One of the men was holding the kid, while the others stripped the man of his clothes and beat him to death before hacking his body up. Cannibals. Alex watched as they dumped all the scrap out of the basket and tossed in the hunks of human flesh, making their haul easier to carry. There was nothing he could do for the man, but the kid didn't deserve to die like that. No one did. Powerless without a gun, he was forced to stay silent and watch as they did the most horrible things to the child, before one of them ended it by stomping in his skull, tossing his lifeless body in the scraps of what Alex guessed was his father. They walked away laughing and talking amongst themselves. When they'd vanished into the night, he continued his journey. The sun would be coming up soon, and as dangerous as the nights were, the light of the day only made things worse. During the day, what was left of the local population came out of hiding. With no gun, he would be an easy target, and losing the little food he was carrying would be a death sentence. Looking around the street, he spotted an old 2-story house that was barely standing. Better than nothing, he thought, running towards the old husk. Once he'd gotten inside and hidden his bag, Alex pulled a machete out and started searching through the rubble. There wasn't much to find. Most of the walls had been stripped down to the studs. A pile of old bones were piled up in what used to be a fireplace. He couldn't tell if they were human or not, and he didn't actually care. Heading for the kitchen area, he spotted something odd. There was an old mattress propped up against the back door. Over the years, he'd seen plenty of things like this. It usually meant someone had been there recently. Stopping in his tracks, he stood there listening for signs of movement. It could have been from the tall man and the child. There was no way to tell in any case. He dragged the mattress upstairs in a hurry, then settled in to let the day pass. When the sun finally started to set, Alex grabbed his gear and headed out. The day had been silent. Other than a pack of dogs and a handful of wanderers, there hadn't been much action. He walked the streets cautiously, being sure to check behind him every few minutes, and occasionally switching directions to keep anyone from tracking him. By the time he'd made it to the outer edge of the neighborhood, it was dark. From here, he was going to have to take the highway for at least a few miles. That meant he wouldn't have the luxury of hiding spots, and he would be exposed. But there was no other way to the warehouse district. In the distance, he could hear the sound of gunfire. There was no way for him to tell how close they were, so he picked up his pace to a light jog. When he made it to the old highway, he took cover under the remains of an overpass and waited to hear if anyone was close by, and it was a good thing he did. Within minutes, a small group came walking by. They hadn't noticed him, but that didn't stop his heart from pounding. By the look of them, he guessed they were nomads, but it was hard to tell. It wasn't like people walked around with flags advertising who they were. Clutching his machete, he watched them move through scavenging the rusted remains of old cars that littered the road. When they finished, they piled the few items they'd found into a burlap sack and moved on. The rest of his walk on the highway was fairly uneventful. Along the way, he'd found an old soccer ball that he kicked as he walked to pass the time. Once he was close to his exit point, he kicked the ball away and climbed over the concrete guardrail. When he'd reached the bottom of the incline that led up to the road, he stopped. Not 10 feet away from him was a cardboard box that seemed to be moving. Pulling his machete, he approached it slowly and tapped it with his foot. A soft whining came from the box, and Alex instantly recognized the sound. It was a puppy. Kneeling down, he opened the flaps to see a small brown and white pup. His first thought was to bash it to death and use it for food, but as he looked down at it, he smiled. Having a companion might be just what he needed. Scooping it up into his arms, it licked his face, then playfully chewed at his fingers. He chuckled and spoke softly. "Come along, little one. We've got things to do." Walking along, he rolled through lists of the names for the dog in his head, and eventually coming to the decision that he would call her Cheeto, after his favorite snack. By the time he made it to the warehouse district, he was exhausted. Since there was no hurry to get back, he decided to make camp in the first building he came to. Once he was sure his tracks were covered, and he was shielded from the outside world, he got a fire started. After a small meal of beef jerky that he shared with Cheeto, he settled in to get some rest. Laying by the fire, he slowly dozed off with her in his arms. Alex dreamt of the old days. Memories of swimming pools and movie theaters filled his sleep with happy thoughts. Waking up to puppy breath as she licked his nose made him smile. The fire had died while they rested, but it didn't matter. It was time to get moving. After hours of searching, he finally found a few small bottles of water, a first aid kit, and an old moving pad he could use as a blanket. It wasn't the best haul, but it would have to do. After sharing some of a bottle of water, he gathered up his things and hit the road.